and durability, tile is an excellent choice. In addition to giving your home a great look, it also helps protect the walls and floors from various kinds of damage. Tiling gives homeowners an easy, affordable way to add charm and beauty to their homes, with results that rival those of tiling professionals. The Home Depot is here to provide the products and guidance you need to achieve those professional-looking results. In our first demonstration, we'll install wainscot tile with a cap in a bathroom. The first step is to measure the tile. Place 10 tiles side by side and measure the length of the row. Divide by 10 and use the resulting number as the tile dimension for your layout. Using a level, draw a top line all the way around the room. If you're tiling only partway up the wall, this line should be where the tiles will stop. If you'll be adding a row of cap tiles like we are, draw a horizontal line for those as well. Now measure from the floor to the top line and mark a mid-height line halfway in between. Then measure from the floor to the top line again and divide by the size of the tile. If you end up with less than a full tile as your remainder, shift the mid-height line down by that amount so you'll have a row of full tiles at the top and a row of partial tiles at the bottom. Draw a new mid-height line around the room, making sure it's level. Measure the width of each wall and mark the midpoint on the top line. Using a level, extend this line to the floor. Now measure from this line to one end of the wall and divide by the size of the tile. If the last row of tiles will be less than a half a tile wide, shift the midpoint so the last row of tile on both ends of the wall will be of equal width and draw a new line. Using a chalk line, snap additional vertical and horizontal lines to create a grid of 8 to 12 square foot rectangles on the wall. When this is done, you're ready to start tiling. Start by fastening a level 1x2 or 1x3 wooden batten just below the mid-height line. Double check to make sure it's level. The batten will keep your first row of tiles straight, which will make the rest of the tiles on the wall straight as well. Mix your latex modified thin set mortar as instructed in the techniques section of Tiling 123. Using a square notch trowel, apply mortar to one of the marked grids along the top of the batten and comb it into straight vertical ridges as described in the techniques section of this DVD. Press the first few full tiles in place above the batten. Use a slight twisting motion to be sure it makes good contact with the mortar. Do not slide the tiles. After you've done 3 or 4 tiles, lift one off and check the back. The mortar should cover the entire surface. If it's in rows, the troweled ridges on the wall aren't thick enough. Scrape the mortar off the wall and reapply it using a trowel with a larger notch. Work up and out in a stair-step pattern. Take your time and work on the wall in manageable 8 to 12 square foot sections. Set any tile that must be cut last. If any mortar oozes up between the tiles, clean it up before it dries. Continue until all except the top row of cap tiles are in place. Finish by placing the row of cap tiles along the top of the tiled area. When you're done, let the mortar cure for at least 12 hours and remove the batten. Working from the middle out and down, set the rest of the tiles. Support each tile with a piece of masking tape attached to the tile above it. Let the mortar dry completely. Each type of mortar has a different curing time. Be sure to follow the manufacturer's instructions. Grout is the material that fills the space between the tiles and supports them, almost like glue. Grouting is messy, so be sure you properly cover any areas that you don't want to get dirty. Before you start, remove any excess mortar with a razor blade or a putty knife. Using a margin trowel, mix the powdered grout with liquid and apply it as recommended in the techniques section. Skim the excess grout off with the edge of the float. To avoid digging into the joints, move the float diagonally across the tiles. The grout will set up in about 5 to 15 minutes and have a putty-like consistency. When a thumbnail pressed against it doesn't leave an impression, the grout is hard enough for the final cleanup. With a damp sponge, wipe the tiles diagonally to clean them. Rinse the sponge frequently in clean water. The sponging process will leave a haze on the tile. To remove it, wipe the surface with a damp rag, then with a clean, dry rag. Repeat this process until the tile is as reflective as glass. Holding a lamp to the surface can help you check it. Cure the grout as instructed in the techniques section and let it set thoroughly before applying sealer. The curing process is very important. Do not disturb it. Once the grout has cured, apply sealer with a sponge. Sealing tile grout gives it greater water and mildew resistance and helps keep it from getting dirty. Make sure to wipe off any drips before the sealer dries, and if you are using unglazed tile, seal it as well.
The three walls surrounding a shower and bathtub require more than a traditional wallboard surface because of the constant wet and damp conditions. Ceramic wall tile is a great choice. It's tough, easy to clean, and it can stand up to all the wetness a busy shower receives. Ceramic tile can be installed directly over wallboard, plaster, or existing tile, but it must be attached to a surface that's structurally strong enough to support the weight. In this demonstration, we'll be installing backer board, which most tile manufacturers recommend. Before you start, protect the inside of the tub with cardboard. Start by sealing the edges of the tub flange with asphalt roofing cement. This will seal the tub to the waterproof felt or polyethylene plastic we'll be attaching. Next, staple 15-pound felt to the studs. Embed the bottom layer into the asphalt cement on the tub flange. Overlap the second layer of felt at least 2 inches over the top of the first layer. Use only enough staples to hold the felt in place. If you're covering an outside wall, use 4mm polyethylene plastic instead of felt to prevent moisture problems. Once all the felt or plastic is attached, place 1/4-inch shims along the top of the tub. The gap will prevent water on the rim of the tub from wicking up behind the backer board. Fasten cement backer board sheets to the studs using backer board screws. Use fiberglass tape to reinforce the corners and joint. Then use thin-set mortar to skim and level them. Finally, seal the gap where the backer board meets the tub with a clear or white silicone. This will allow the tub to expand and contract slightly. Before you start working with the tile, determine its actual size. Place 10 tiles side by side and measure the length of the row. Divide by 10 and use the resulting number as the tile dimension for your layout. Measure the height of the back wall from the top of the tub to the ceiling, or wherever the top row of tiles will be. Calculate and mark the horizontal midpoint of the wall. Measure from the height of the back wall again and divide by the size of the tile you're using. If you end up with less than a full tile as your remainder, shift the mid-height line up by that amount. This will give you a row of full tiles along the top of the tub and a row of partial tiles at the top of the wall. Draw a new mid-height line and extend it to all 3 walls. Make sure it's level. Now measure the width of the back wall and mark the mid-width point. Using a level, extend the line to the floor. Measure from the mid-width point to either corner and divide by the size of the tile. If the end tiles will be less than a half tile wide, shift the midpoint so the tiles on both ends will be of equal width and draw a new mid-width line. Repeat this process for the other 2 walls. Using a chalk line, snap additional vertical and horizontal lines to create a grid of 8 to 12 square foot rectangles on the walls. Once this is done, you're ready to start tiling.
Start by fastening a level 1x2 or 1x3 wooden batten just below the mid-height line. Double check to make sure it's level. The batten will keep your first row of tiles straight, which will make the rest of the tiles on the wall straight as well. Mix your latex modified thin-set mortar as instructed in the technique section of Tiling 1, 2, 3. Using a square notch trowel, apply mortar to one of the marked grids along the top of the batten and comb it into straight vertical ridges as described in the technique section of this DVD. Press the first few full tiles in place above the batten. Use a slight twisting motion to be sure it makes good contact with the mortar. Do not slide the tiles. After you've done 3 or 4 tiles, lift one off and check the back. The mortar should cover the entire surface. If it's in rows, the troweled ridges on the wall aren't thick enough. Scrape the mortar off the wall and reapply it using a trowel with a larger notch. Work up and out in a stair-step pattern. Take your time and work on the wall in manageable 8 to 12 square foot sections.
Mark, cut, and set the tiles around the shower arm. For detailed instructions, explore the technique section of this disc. Set any top or end tiles that must be cut last. If any mortar oozes up between the tiles while you're working, clean it up before it dries. Continue up the wall, finishing with the row of cap tiles. Once you're done, let the mortar cure for at least 12 hours, then remove the batten. Working from the middle out and down, set the rest of the tiles. To keep the tiles from sliding down, support each with a piece of masking tape attached to the tile above it. Let the mortar dry completely. Each type of mortar has a different curing time. Be sure to follow the manufacturer's instructions. After the mortar has dried, set any accessories in place. Use masking tape to support it until the mortar has cured. Do not install a tray with a towel bar that might be mistaken for a handhold. Grouting is the next step in the tiling process.
Grout is the material that fills the space between the tiles and supports them, almost like glue. Grouting is messy, so be sure you properly cover any areas that you don't want to get dirty. Before you start, remove any excess mortar with a razor blade. Using a margin trowel, mix the powdered grout with liquid and apply it as recommended in the technique section. Skim the excess grout off with the edge of the float. To avoid digging into the joints, move the float diagonally across the tiles. The grout will set up in about 5 to 15 minutes and have a putty-like consistency. When a thumbnail pressed against it doesn't leave an impression, the grout is hard enough for the final cleanup. With a damp sponge, wipe the tiles diagonally to clean them. Rinse the sponge frequently in clean water.
Remove any remaining haze as instructed in the technique section. Repeat this process until the tile is as reflective as glass. Cure the grout as instructed in the technique section of Tiling 1, 2, 3, and let it set thoroughly before applying sealer. The curing process is very important. Do not disturb it. Once the grout has cured, apply sealer with a sponge. Sealing tile grout gives it a greater water and mildew resistance and helps keep it from getting dirty. Make sure to wipe off any excess within 10 minutes. Don't let it dry on the tile. And if you're using an unglazed tile, seal it as well. Finally, caulk the tub and tile joint with a bath and tub caulk. Use a color that matches either the tub or the tile. To smooth the bead, use a wet finger or sponge and lightly draw it across the caulk.
Ceramic tile is great for floors. It's attractive, hard-wearing, easy to clean, and it comes in styles, colors, and patterns to match any decor. The quality of the finished floor depends on 2 things: careful planning and the quality of the surface beneath it. For best results, use backerboard to create a smooth, level surface. In this demonstration, we'll be installing backerboard and 16-inch by 16-inch field tiles in a kitchen.
Before installing the backerboard, check the subfloor to be sure it isn't warped, loose, or damaged. Pull out any loose nails and replace them with deck screws to eliminate squeaks.
Measure the space to determine how much backerboard is necessary. Multiply this number by 5% to allow for mistakes and unusable pieces.
Check the installation area so that it's free of dust, dirt, and debris. Use a vacuum to make sure everything is completely removed.
Lay out the pattern for the panels. Plan the layout so the backer board will span and reinforce the joints in the subfloor. Also, plan on starting every other row with a half panel so the corners of adjacent panels don't line up. Snap chalk lines to show where each panel will go.
Before you mix up the first batch of mortar and start putting down the backer board, decide where you'll lay the first panel. If it'll be a partial panel, cut it to size ahead of time.
To cut backer board, measure and mark cutoff lines on both sides of the panel with a felt tip pen or carbide scoring tool.
Align a straight edge with a line on one side of the panel and pull the scoring tool along it several times. Make as many passes as you need to break through the mesh on the surface.
Place the straight edge on the other side of the panel and repeat the process. With the backer board on a flat surface, press down one side of the cut line with your hand and knee. With the other hand, lift up just enough to snap the board along the scored edges. Some types of backer board may leave a sharp edge along the cut line, so be careful when handling the cut board.
Mix your latex modified thin set mortar as instructed in the technique section of Tiling 123. Then, using a square notch trowel, apply mortar and comb it into straight vertical ridges as described in the technique section of Tiling 123.
Immediately put the first piece of backer board in place. If you don't set the panel when the mortar is wet, gaps will form between the floor and panels, and the tiles will crack when you walk on the gaps.
Place spacers at the walls to leave a gap between the wall and the backer board as recommended by the manufacturer. To set the panel in the mortar, walk on it gently.
Fasten the panel to the floor with 1 1/4 inch backer board screws. Follow the manufacturer's instructions for proper spacing and placement. Drive the heads flush with the surface. Screws placed around the outside of the panel should be a 1/2 inch from the edge.
Apply mortar inside the layout lines for the second panel, the same way you did for the first panel. Set the panel in place and put spacers at the walls to leave the proper gap.
Using 16-penny nails as spacers, leave a 1/8 inch gap between the panels.
One at a time, lay the rest of the panels around the room. Continue to use spacers at the walls and leave 1/8 inch gaps between panels. Once all of the panels are in place, remove all the spacers.
Fill the spaces between the panels with mortar. Use a margin trowel to smooth it and form a 3-inch wide band centered on the joint.
Put fiberglass backer board joint tape across all of the seams and firmly embed them into the mortar. Cover the seams with more mortar and smooth it with a trowel. Don't expose the tape, just feather the edges of the mortar. Once the mortar is dry, you're ready to start tiling. The first step is to lay out the floor. Proper pre-planning will help you avoid costly, time-consuming mistakes and a lot of frustration. Laying the plan out on graph paper will help you decide where to start and what the finished floor will look like. There are also software programs available that can help you design, plan, and estimate quantities. To begin the actual layout, start by finding the center of the room. Measure the longest wall, calculate its midpoint, and mark it. Do the same on the opposite wall and snap a chalk line between the two midpoints. Repeat the process for the other two walls.
The two guidelines you snapped, called layout lines, must be square to each other. If they're not, the tiles won't be centered and the room will look unbalanced. Here's how to measure for square.
Starting at the intersection of the lines, measure and mark one of the layout lines at 3 feet. Measure and mark the other layout line 4 feet from the intersection. If the two lines are square, the distance between the two marks you made will be exactly 5 feet. If it is, you're ready to go. If it's not, draw the diagonal line on the floor with a pencil for reference.
To fix the problem, move the end of either of the layout lines. Whichever line you choose, move the end closest to the pencil line you sketched on the floor. If the diagonal measured more than 5 feet, move the end of the line toward the 90-degree angle. If it measured less than 5 feet, move the line away from the 90-degree angle. Snap a new line.
To make the process of actually laying out the tiles in mortar easier, it helps to set them in sections or grids. To lay out the sections, make a jury stick. Lay out a section of tiles with spacers and place a piece of 1-inch stock along one edge. Mark the edges of the tiles on the stick. Set the stick along the wall and mark the floor at each mark on the stick. Repeat this for each wall.
If you're working in a smaller area, you can set out tiles to check your layout. On a large floor, snap chalk lines to create a layout grid. Then you're ready to set your tiles.
Without mortar, lay out a row of tiles along the chalk lines in both directions, starting at the center point and working out. Insert spacers between the tiles. Stop when the remaining space is less than a full tile. If the space between the last full tile and the wall is less than half a tile wide, move the layout line parallel to that wall until the tiles at both ends are equal width. Repeat the process for the tiles along the other layout line. Re-snap the lines and measure to be sure they're still square. Starting at the center of the room, use a trowel to spread and comb mortar up to the edge of one of your layout lines.
Put two tiles in place next to each other with a spacer in between and press them firmly into the mortar. If mortar squeezes up between the tiles, the bed is too thick and the ridges need to be shorter. Lift up one of the tiles and look at the bottom. The mortar should cover the entire surface. If you see parallel lines, the mortar is too dry. If the ridges of the mortar have left solid lines on the tile, the bed is too thin and you need to increase the height of the ridges. Place spacers beside the first tile and set the second tile in place, twisting it slightly.
After you've installed 3 or 4 tiles, place a 2x4 or beater block on top of them and tap lightly with a hammer or rubber mallet. This will level the tiles and embed them firmly in the mortar. Continue setting tiles in the same way until you reach the end of the layout section. Use a damp sponge to clean off any mortar that sticks to the top of the tiles. Don't let it dry. After you've finished the first section, work on a neighboring section in the same quadrant. Spread mortar on the grid and lay the tiles. Keep laying tiles in this pattern until you reach a point where the space between the tiles and the wall is less than a full tile width. To cut the tiles along the wall, place the tile you're going to cut directly on top of the last full tile near the wall. Place the second tile upright against the wall. And place a third tile against it and on top of the tile to be cut. Trace along the edge of the third tile to draw a line on the first tile. Cut the tile and it will fit perfectly into the space. It's a good idea to measure, cut, and install one tile at a time. Continue tiling until the floor is complete. Once all the tiles are in place, let the mortar dry completely. Each type of mortar has a different curing time. Follow the manufacturer's instructions.
Grouting is the next step in the tiling process. Grout fills the space between the tiles. Grouting is messy, so be sure to properly cover any areas that you don't want to get dirty. Before you start, remove any excess mortar with a razor blade or a putty knife. Using a margin trowel, mix the powdered grout with liquid and apply it as recommended in the techniques section. Skim the excess grout off with the edge of the float. To avoid digging into the joints, move the float diagonally across the tiles. The grout will set up in about 5 to 15 minutes and have a putty-like consistency. When a thumbnail pressed against it doesn't leave an impression, the grout is hard enough for the final cleanup.
With a damp sponge, wipe the tiles diagonally to clean them. Rinse the sponge frequently in clean water. Remove any remaining haze as instructed in the technique section. Cure the grout as instructed in the technique section of tiling 1, 2, 3, and let it set thoroughly before applying sealer. The curing process is very important. Do not disturb it. Once the grout has cured, apply sealer with a sponge. Sealing tile grout gives it a greater water and mildew resistance and helps keep it from getting dirty. Make sure to wipe off any excess within 10 minutes. Don't let it dry on the tile. And if you're using an unglazed tile, seal it as well.
Mosaic tiles are 2 inches square or smaller. They can be installed individually or pre-mounted on mesh-backed sheets. In this demonstration, we'll be installing 12 by 12 inch mesh sheets in a bathroom. Before you start laying the tile, make sure the floor is smooth and level. Clean and vacuum the area to remove any dust, dirt, and debris. Snap layout lines to divide the floor into quadrants and sections. Square the lines and adjust them so the edges will be of equal width. Or, if you are tiling a small floor, you can lay out the tiles without layout lines, testing for color and pattern and measuring end tiles for cuts. If you're using porous, natural slate tiles like we are, they must be sealed before grouting.
Mix your latex modified thin-set mortar as instructed in the technique section of Tiling 123. Since this excess can't be cleaned out, use a mortar color that matches the grout you'll be using. Starting at the center of the room and using a square notch trowel, apply the mortar to one of the marked grids and comb it into straight vertical ridges as described in the technique section of Tiling 123. Set the first sheet of tile into one of the corners formed by the center layout lines. Press it into place by placing a small beater block on it and tapping lightly with a rubber mallet. Lift the sheet and check the bottom. The mortar should cover the entire surface. If parts of the back are bare, recomb mortar with a trowel with a larger notch before resetting the sheet. Reset the first sheet and install the second sheet. Press both sheets into place with a beater block. Make sure both sheets are flat and at the same level. Also check that they're properly aligned with each other. If one sheet is a little crooked, all the sheets you put down after it will be crooked too. Keep laying sheets the same way. Make sure each is flat, level with the other sheets around it, and properly aligned. When you finish with one section, lay down mortar for the next. As you work, use a damp sponge to wipe off any mortar that gets on the surface of the tiles. Continue tiling until the floor is complete. Once all the tiles are in place, let the mortar dry completely. Each type of mortar has a different curing time. Be sure to follow the manufacturer's instructions.
Grouting is the next step in the tiling process. Grout fills the space between the tiles. Grouting is messy, so be sure to properly cover any areas that you don't want to get dirty. Using a margin trowel, mix the powdered grout with liquid and apply it as recommended in the technique section. Skim the excess grout off with the edge of the float. To avoid digging into the joints, move the float diagonally across the tiles. The grout will set up in about 5 to 15 minutes and have a putty-like consistency. When a thumbnail pressed against it doesn't leave an impression, the grout is hard enough for the final cleanup. With a damp sponge, wipe the tiles diagonally to clean them. Rinse the sponge frequently in clean water. The sponging process will leave a haze on the tile. To remove it, wipe the surface with a damp rag, then with a clean, dry rag. Cure the grout as instructed in the techniques section and let it set thoroughly before applying sealer. The curing process is very important. Do not disturb it. Once the grout has cured, apply sealer with a sponge. Sealing tile grout gives it greater water and mildew resistance and helps keep it from getting dirty. Make sure to wipe off any drips before the sealer dries. Ceramic tile is an excellent choice for a countertop. In addition to its beauty, ceramic tile resists heat, moisture, and stains. As with all tiling projects, planning and surface preparation are the keys to success. In this demonstration, we'll show you how to prepare the substrate, install backer-board, and tile a kitchen counter with a V-cap edge.
Before you begin, protect the base cabinets from damage and falling mortar by covering them with plastic sheeting or construction paper. Also place a drop cloth on the floor.
Countertop tiles must be set on a surface that's level, solid, and can withstand moisture. If you're going to be tiling the front edge, the base also must be thick enough to accommodate the edging you've chosen. The minimum requirement is 3/4 inch exterior grade plywood attached with 1 1/4 inch drywall screws. Shim the top as needed to get it level. If the counter you're tiling has an existing countertop surface, it's best to remove it and start with a new base and backerboard.
Measure and cut the opening for the sink. If you're installing a new sink, it may come with a template. If you're reusing an old sink, measure the opening after you remove it. Make sure the placement of the sink leaves enough space so the faucet will clear the wall behind the counter. Also adjust the location if possible, so that when you install the tile, the cut tiles on the left and right side of the sink are the same size for a balanced look.
After making the cutout, drill a 3/8 inch starter hole inside the cutout near one of the corners, and use a saber saw to remove the cutout.
To install the backerboard, measure and mark the pieces based on the dimensions of the counter and the backsplash. Make sure no joints cross the hole for the sink. To cut the backerboard, mark cutoff lines on both sides of the panel with a felt tip pen or carbide scoring tool. Align a straight edge with the line on the side of the panel and pull the scoring tool along it several times. Make as many passes as you need to break through the surface. Do the same on the other side of the panel. With the backerboard on a flat surface, press down one side of the cut line with your hand and knee. With the other hand, lift up just enough to snap the board along the scored edges. Some types of backerboard may leave a sharp edge along the cut line, so be careful when handling the cut board. Dry fit the backerboard sections on top of the plywood, covering the entire surface. Make sure the edges of the backerboard and the plywood base are all perfectly flush.
Leave 1/8 inch gaps between the adjacent panels using 16 penny spacer nails.
Also leave a 1/8 inch gap at the back of the countertop for expansion.
Using the existing cutout as your guide, trace the perimeter of the sink hole on the underside of the backerboard. Or, if you are using a large sink like we are, cut backerboard pieces to fit around it.
Cut it out using a circular saw with a dry cutting diamond blade, and finish the corners with a jigsaw. We're now ready to install the backerboard.
Mix your latex modified thin set mortar as instructed in the techniques section of Tiling 123.
Using a 1/8 inch square notch trowel, apply an even layer of mortar to the plywood and comb it into straight vertical ridges. Set the pieces of backerboard in place on the mortar. Remember to leave 1/8 inch gaps at the joints. Use 16D spacer nails, but don't drive them into the plywood. Also remember to leave a 1/8 inch gap at the back of the countertop for expansion.
Attach the panels with backerboard screws. Place them 4 inches on center and 1/2 inch from the edge all the way around each panel. You may find it easier to start the screws if you tap them lightly with a hammer to start them. Drive the screws until the heads are flush with the surface.
To avoid breaking off a corner, keep the screws 2 inches from the corners of the board.
Place screws every 6 inches on both directions in the field of each board.
Spread mortar on the backerboard strip for the backsplash and set it in place, leaving a 1/8 inch gap above the countertop. Attach it with screws. Once all the panels are in place, remove all the spacers. Fill the spaces between the panels with mortar. Use a margin trowel to smooth it out and form a 3-inch wide band centered on the joint. For reinforcement, put fiberglass backerboard tape across each joint and firmly embed it into the mortar.
Cover the joints with additional mortar and smooth it with a trowel. Don't expose the tape, just feather the edges of the mortar.
Apply a coat of mortar to the edges of the countertop. Wrap them in fiberglass tape and apply a skim coat of mortar.
Once the mortar is dry, we're ready to mark our layout lines. We're going to be using edge tiles, but if you're using cap tiles, hold one of them against the front edge of the counter, mark the location of the back joint, and do the same at the other end of the counter. Snap a layout line between the marks. This will be your first joint line. If you're tiling an L-shaped counter, measure and mark the other leg as well.
Where the layout lines intersect will be the location of the first full tile. This will ensure full tiles along both front edges. Snap additional lines to divide the rest of the countertop into sections or grids.
Attach a 1x2 batten under the front edge of the counter to support the trim tiles, and you're ready to start setting the tile.
Using a square notched trowel, spread and comb an even layer of mortar along the edge of the counter up to the layout lines. Put 2 edge tiles in place next to each other and press them firmly into the mortar. If the mortar squeezes up between the tiles, the bed is too thick and the ridges need to be shorter. Lift up one of the tiles and look at the bottom. The mortar should cover the entire surface. If you see parallel lines, the mortar is too dry. If the ridges of the mortar have left solid lines on the tile, the mortar bed is too thin and you need to increase the height of the ridges. Remove both tiles, recomb the area you just tested, and reset the first tile. Twist the tile back and forth slightly to make sure that it's embedded in the mortar. Continue setting the rest of the edge tiles the same way.
Use a damp sponge to clean off any mortar that sticks to the top of the tiles before it dries, or you can carefully use a putty knife. To install your tiles, start at the intersection of the 2 original layout lines you snapped. Spread and comb thin set into the area.
Place a corner of the first tile at the intersection. Twist it back and forth slightly to embed it in the mortar. Continue setting the entire row of field tiles adjacent to the edge tiles. Once the first row is set, continue to work outward toward the back of the counter and around the sink. Use a damp sponge to clean up any excess mortar as you go. Set all the full tiles first and leave any cut tiles on the perimeter and around the sink for last. As you work, periodically check for flatness with the level. If you need to level any tiles, place a beater bar on top of the tiles and tap it lightly with a hammer or a rubber mallet.
To tile the backsplash, spread and comb mortar onto the backer board, and then place the vertical tiles. To allow enough space for grout, set the tiles on 1/8 inch shims, or you can use spacers. If the backsplash is only a single row high, you can use bullnose tile to finish the top. We're using small pieces of cut tile to finish. Cut and back butter each piece and press it into place. Once all the tiles are set, we're ready to grout. If you're using unglazed tile on the countertop, seal it with penetrating sealer before grouting.
Grouting fills the space between the tiles. It's messy, so be sure to cover any areas you don't want to get dirty. Before you start, remove any excess mortar with a razor blade. Using a margin trowel, mix the powdered grout with liquid as recommended in the technique section. You have choices to make when choosing the grout color for a countertop. White grout will emphasize darker tile, but it needs to be regularly cleaned and sealed to prevent staining. Selecting a color that closely matches the color of the tile will help hide stains. If you're using a high glazed tile, which scratches easily, use a non-sanded grout. Apply the grout as described in the technique section. Skim off the excess grout with the edge of the float. To avoid digging into the joints, move the float diagonally across the tiles. The grout will set up in about 5 to 15 minutes and have a putty-like consistency. When a thumbnail pressed against it doesn't leave an impression, the grout is hard enough for the final cleanup. With a damp sponge, wipe the tiles diagonally to clean them. Rinse the sponge frequently in clean water. Remove any remaining haze as instructed in the technique section. If you have trouble removing the haze, use an acid tile cleaner. Let the grout cure completely as recommended by the manufacturer. Once it's cured, apply a food-safe sealer with a sponge. Sealing gives the grout greater water and mildew resistance and helps keep it from getting dirty. Make sure to wipe off any excess within 10 minutes. Don't let it dry on the tile. Once the sealer has cured, the project's done.
Tile backsplash makes a great addition to a kitchen. It's durable, easy to clean, and can enhance the kitchen's overall look and functionality. In this demonstration, we'll be installing a 2-foot-high backsplash with glass tile accents. A substrate of backerboard is the first choice for new work. This is what we'll be doing. But tile can be successfully attached to existing walls using mastic. Mastic is a specially formulated, ready-to-use adhesive that doesn't require mixing and is better than mortar at holding tile to a vertical surface. Before applying mastic to the wall, lightly hand sand the surface with 80 grit sandpaper to roughen it, which helps bond the mastic to the wall. Don't sand away the paint.
When you're done, wipe off the dust with a damp rag. On the counter below the space, lay out a row of tiles wide enough to fill the area you're tiling. Adjust the row left or right so any cut tiles will be the same width on both ends. On the wall, mark the location of one edge of the tile that's closest to the center.
With a notched trowel, spread enough thinset or mastic across the wall for the bottom row of tiles. Hold the trowel at a slight angle and use a sweeping motion. Place the edge of the first tile on the plumb line you drew and press it firmly into the mastic or thinset. Use shims to leave room at the bottom of the tile for a thin bead of caulk, or spacers will also work. Make sure the base of the tile is parallel with the top of the counter.
Continue setting the bottom row of tiles, working out in both directions from the middle. When you've completed the bottom row, continue working upward a row at a time until you reach the top.
When you're done tiling, allow the mastic or thinset to dry overnight before grouting.
Grouting fills in the space between the tiles. It's messy, so be sure to cover any areas that you don't want to get dirty. Using a margin trowel, mix the powdered grout with liquid and apply it as recommended in the technique section. Skim off the excess grout with the edge of the float. To avoid digging into the joints, move the float diagonally across the tiles. Allow the grout to set to a putty-like consistency. When a thumbnail pressed against it doesn't leave an impression, it's hard enough for the final cleanup. With a damp sponge, wipe the tiles diagonally to clean them. Rinse the sponge frequently in clean water. Remove any remaining haze as instructed in the technique section. Let the grout cure completely as recommended by the manufacturer. Once it's cured, apply a food-safe sealer with a sponge. Sealing gives the grout greater water and mildew resistance and helps keep it from getting dirty. Make sure to wipe off any excess within 10 minutes. Don't let it dry on the tile. Squeeze a thin bead of tub and tile caulk into the joints at the very bottom of the backsplash, in any corners, and between the tiles and any cabinets. Smooth it with a wet sponge or finger, and you're done.
The first thing that attracts most people's attention in a bathroom is the vanity, and ceramic tile is a popular choice for vanity tops. It comes in a wide variety of colors and sizes, and it can be mixed and matched in countless combinations for a custom look. In this demonstration, we'll show you how to install and prepare the substrate, install backerboard, and tile a bathroom vanity and backsplash using mesh-backed sheets of 1-inch mosaic tile and V-cap edge tiles. Hold one of the cap tiles against the front edge of the vanity countertop and mark the location of the back joint. Do the same at the other end of the vanity countertop. Snap or draw a layout line between the marks. This will be your first joint line. Lay out the mesh-backed sheets of mosaic tile across the entire countertop. The front row should be lined up along the front line you made. Mark the back of the last full sheet of tiles near the backsplash. Do the same with the last full sheets on the sides. Also, draw reference lines for the last full sheets around the sink cutouts. With the edges marked, we're ready to start setting the tile. If you need to, support the V-cap edge tiles while the mortar dries by attaching a 1x2-inch batten under the front edge of the counter. Using a square notch trowel, spread and comb an even layer of mortar along the edge of the counter up to the layout line. Twist the tile back and forth slightly to make sure it's embedded in the thin set. Continue setting the rest of the edge tiles the same way. Use a damp sponge or putty knife to clean off any mortar that sticks to the top of the tiles before it dries. Set the sheets of mosaic tiles starting at the front and middle of the counter. Work outward toward the edges and the back. Set all of your full sheets first, leaving any cut tiles on the perimeter and the cut tiles around the sink for last. As you set the sheets in place, you want to embed them into the adhesive and make sure they're at the same height. Put a beater board across the tile and gently hit it with a hammer or rubber mallet. Use a damp sponge to clean up any excess mortar as you go. After setting all of your full tiles, measure, cut, and set the tile around the edges and the sinks. It's easiest to use tile nippers. To cut curved lines for the sink areas, cut the small straight cuts close together up to the curved line. The cut edges along the walls and sink openings won't be seen. The edge tiles will be covered with caulk, and the sink tiles will be covered by the lip of the sink. Cut and test fit each sheet first. Then set them all at once. If you can't trowel the mortar directly on the countertop at the sides or around the sink, back butter the sheets individually. When tiling the backsplash, be sure to line up the tiles with the countertop. To finish off the top of the backsplash, we're using rounded bullnose tile. Use a level to ensure the tops of the tiles are straight. Once all the tiles are in place, let the mortar dry completely. Each type of mortar has a different curing time. Be sure to follow the manufacturer's instructions. Grout fills the space between the tiles. Grouting is messy, so be sure to properly cover any areas that you don't want to get dirty. Using a margin trowel, mix the powdered grout with liquid and apply it as recommended in the technique section. Skim the excess grout off with the edge of the float. To avoid digging into the joints, move the float diagonally across the tiles. The grout will set up in about 5 to 15 minutes and have a putty-like consistency. When a thumbnail pressed against it doesn't leave an impression, the grout is hard enough for the final cleanup. With a damp sponge, wipe the tiles diagonally to clean them. Rinse the sponge frequently in clean water. Remove any remaining haze as instructed in the technique section. Repeat this process until the tile is clean. Cure the grout as instructed in the technique section of tiling 1, 2, 3 and let it set thoroughly before applying sealer. The curing process is very important. Do not disturb it. When the grout has cured, apply penetrating sealer with a sponge. Sealing tile grout gives it greater water and mildew resistance and helps keep it from getting dirty. Make sure to wipe off any excess within 10 minutes. Don't let it dry on the tile. And if you're using unglazed tile, seal it as well. Squeeze a thin bead of tub and tile caulk into the joint at the bottom of the backsplash and in the corners. Smooth it with a wet sponge or finger, and you're done.
The first and most important steps of any tiling project is estimating how much material you'll need. In addition to helping you avoid ordering too much or too little of something, estimating quantities allows you to realistically calculate the potential cost of the project. To calculate the amount of flooring material you'll need for a room, multiply the room's length times its width, rounded to the nearest foot. This will determine the square footage. Then add 10% for waste. For example, if the room is 10 feet by 12 feet, you'd have 120 square feet. Add 10%, 12 feet, and the total is 132 square feet. If you're installing a floor tile using a diagonal pattern, or the room has lots of curves and corners, add 15% for waste. If the room has any obstructions, counters, protruding closets, and so forth, subtract their square footage from the overall square footage of the room. Calculating the amount of material needed to cover walls is essentially the same process. Measure the area to be tiled on each wall, add all the walls together, and figure the square footage. Add a waste factor of 10%, and you've got the amount of material you'll need. Ceramic trim and accent pieces are typically sold by the piece. To figure out how many you'll need, divide the total length of the border in inches by the length of the trim piece. For example, if you have 9 feet of exposed edge that needs trim, that's 108 inches. If each piece of trim is 6 inches long, divide the 108 inches you're covering by 6 inches. You'll need 18 pieces of trim. If each piece of trim was 8 inches long, you'd need 13.5 pieces. These formulas will help you estimate the quantities you'll need. To be safe, it's always a good idea to have someone with good math skills review your measurements and quantities before you place an order or start a project. Using a 5-gallon bucket and a variable speed drill with a mortar paddle, mix latex modified thin-set mortar at slow speed according to the manufacturer's instructions. Mix up 1/4 of a bag at a time. Mortar is caustic, so wear safety glasses and rubber gloves. Let the mortar rest for 10 minutes, then mix again. Using a margin trowel, mix the powdered grout with liquid as recommended by the manufacturer. Once it's mixed, let the grout rest for 10 to 15 minutes, then remix it. If the grout is too stiff to be spread, add additional liquid. The sponging process will leave a haze on the tile. To remove it, wipe the surface with a damp rag, then with a clean dry rag. Using a square-notched trowel, apply an even layer of mortar to one of the marked grids located along the top of the batten. Do not cover more than 12 square feet. Press the mortar into the backer board with the straight edge of the trowel, holding it at a shallow angle. Spread the mortar up to the reference lines, but don't cover them. Then, using the notched edge of the trowel, comb the mortar into straight vertical ridges. Holding the trowel at a steep angle and pressing down so the teeth contact the backer board will help you spread the mortar evenly. Apply the grout to the tiled surface using a hard rubber grout float held at a 45-degree angle. Smear on about a cup of grout at a time, pressing it into the joints with several sweeps. Work on a small area, complete it, and move on to another area. To cure the grout, spray it with a fine mist of cool, clean water several times a day for 3 days. This helps increase the strength of the grout and reduce its water absorbency. An important note, if you use colored grout, don't mist it. This can dissolve the tint and leave you with an inconsistent color. Once you're done misting, let the grout set thoroughly before applying sealer. The curing process is very important. Do not disturb it.
Any type of ceramic tile work, it's inevitable that you will have to cut and trim some tiles to fit around holes and openings, along edges and borders, or to complete part of a design. With the right tools, cutting ceramic tile is fairly simple. In this section, we'll show you how to cut straight pieces using the 2 common tile cutting tools, a snap cutter and a wet saw. Snap cutters are great for making straight cuts. They hold the tile in place, allow you to score at the cut line, and then snap the tile in 2. If you don't want to buy one, they can be rented from Home Depot. To make a cut, measure and mark the cutting line on the tile. To ensure you end up with a true right angle, use a combination square as your straight edge when drawing the line. Set the tile in the cutter and align it so the cutting wheel rests directly on top of the cut line. Move the wheel away from you to the far edge of the tile. Supporting the tile to keep it level, lower the cutting wheel onto the edge of the tile and pull it toward you. Apply light pressure on the handle. Pressing too hard can cause the tile to crack and break. If the tile is more than 1/4 inch thick, you may have to repeat the process to score the tile deep enough. Lift the cutting wheel and slide the handle to the center of the tile. Lower the pressing T and strike the handle of the cutter quickly to snap the tile along the scoring line. That's all there is to it. If you'll be doing lots of cutting, a wet saw makes the job fast and easy. They're called wet saws because they use water to keep the blade and the tile cool. It also helps reduce the amount of dust thrown out by the saw. Most wet saws have a sliding table that feeds the tile into the overhead blade. Always wear safety glasses and use ear protection when you use a wet saw. Since the saw creates a lot of water splatter, An apron is a good idea too. And anytime you're making adjustments to a wet saw, unplug the unit. As with the snap cutter, measure and mark the cutting line on the tile using a combination square as your straight edge. To help keep your hands away from the blade during the cut, set the fence on the saw so the widest part of the tile is between the blade and the fence. Back the tile away from the blade and turn on the saw. Holding the tile with both hands, feed it along the fence and toward the blade. Move the tile slowly to avoid overheating and cracking. Let the saw do the work and keep your hands away from the blade. When you get to the end of the tile, turn off the saw and then remove the tile. Nearly every tiling job requires trimming tiles to fit around curves and obstructions. With the right tools and some practice, you can learn to cut curves, notches, and holes. In this section, we'll show you how. To make a curved cut on a wet saw, mark the outline of the cut on the tile with a grease pencil. Wearing safety glasses and using ear protection, make a series of straight, parallel cuts from the edge of the tile to the inside edge of the curve. The cut should be about a 1/4 inch apart. The more cuts you make, the smoother and more accurate your curve will be. Turn off the saw when you're done. Use tile nippers to remove the thin slivers. They should snap off easily. Finally, use the saw to smooth any jagged edges around the cutout by applying sideways pressure on the tip of the blade. You can also make curve cuts with tile nippers. This handy tool nibbles off small bits of the tile. Firmly hold the tile glazed side up and starting at one end of the curve, use the nippers to bite into the tile. Gradually widen the cut by nibbling away at it. Now switch to the other end of the curve and repeat the process. Keep alternating sides and work toward the middle until the curve is complete. If you need to smooth any ragged edges left behind, use an abrasive stone or rotary grinder. To cut notches with a wet saw, measure and mark the sides and the end of the notch. Using a wet saw, make a cut along one side of the notch. Rotate the tile, reset the fence, and make the second cut to form the notch. Stop each cut when the blade reaches the line marking the end of the notch. If the notch is wider than an inch, make a series of parallel cuts from the edge of the tile to the line marking the end of the notch. The cut should be about a 1/4 inch apart. To remove the notch, break off the individual slivers with nippers. To trim the remaining ragged edges, put the tile back in the saw. With the saw running and the blade just touching the end of the notch, slide the tile from side to side so the tip of the blade smooths the jagged edge. To cut round holes in tile, use a carbide grit hole saw attached to a drill. To prevent the bit from wandering on the tile's hard, slick glaze when you start cutting, break through the glaze with a center punch. Gently tap it with a hammer. This will give the bit enough grip to dig in and start the hole. With the tile positioned firmly on a piece of scrap plywood, put the saw's pilot bit on the tile. Start drilling slowly and exert very little pressure so you won't break the tile. Take your time. When you feel the drill bit reaching the back of the tile, slow down to ensure a clean exit.
Easy and enjoyable, but it also can be dangerous. By following a few simple precautions, you can prevent injuries. The first rule when working with tile is always to wear eye protection when you're cutting. Select glasses or goggles that shield your eyes and hug the side of your head. Flying debris is quite common when you're using tools, including tile nippers, which can unexpectedly send tiny slivers of sharp tile flying in all directions, power saws, including wet saws, circular saws, grout saws, and rotary cutters. In these cases, ear protection is also a good idea. Tile. A wet saw can help make the job easier. Here are a few tips to help keep you safe. Disconnect the saw whenever you're checking or changing blades. Regularly check the blade for damage. It should be flat with no cracks and no sections of the rim missing. A wet saw is great for curve cutting, but it also can be dangerous. Unlike normal cuts where the tile sits flat and firm on the saw table, hold the tile in your hands to make a curved cut. If the blade gets pinched in the kerf, the tile could be yanked out of your hands or parts of the cutting rim could break off. For stability, rest the heels of your hands on the saw table. There may be times when you need to work around water and electricity. Maybe you're tiling around the shower controls in a bathroom or an electrical outlet in the kitchen. Play it safe. If you're working in or around an outlet or switch, shut off the power before you begin. Turn off the electricity to the room or outlet at the main service panel. Then use a tester to be sure the power really is off. Make sure everyone in the household knows not to turn the power back on while you're working. If necessary, post a sign on the service panel, or lock it if possible. If you need to remove or move a fixture like a sink or a toilet, turn off the water supply valves. If you're removing a sink, turn off the water supply valves to both the hot and cold water faucets. And if there isn't any shutoff valve at the fixture, close your home's main shutoff valve.
Ceramic tile everywhere because it's beautiful, it lasts forever, and it's easy to maintain. And since it's almost impervious to water, it's a natural choice for bathrooms, kitchens, and entryways. Unfortunately, wet, slippery tile is also extremely dangerous. If you're putting tile in an area where slipping might be a problem, here are some things to look for. Rough, naturally textured stone tiles such as slate and unpolished granite. Unglazed or rough-fired clay tiles like quarry and terracotta. Tile with a honed, sandblasted, or split surface, such as limestone. One way to make ceramic tile in wet areas more slip-resistant is to use very small tiles, like mosaics. The additional grout lines help provide more traction. There also are special chemical coatings available that can be applied to tile to make it more slip-resistant.